Magnetic Sound Recording, and we are talking to Ed Helvey. And you've been gracious enough to support us, and we found out you had a phenomenal history, so that's what we're here to do. And you said you started in high school working with AV equipment, and I'd like to know more about that interest, how it got started.
Well, like all kids, in my pre-adolescent years, I was into photography a little bit, and my father built a darkroom for me, so I was doing black and white processing and shooting. And then I got interested in shortwave listening. There was an old radio in the house, and so I started listening to all the foreign stations, and then found the ham radio bands and started listening to ham radio. And so I said, that's interesting. So then I got some books and I read about it, and I learned what I needed to know. And then I found a ham radio operator who lived not too far away, and so I studied, and he gave me my first radio licenses. So I was a licensed ham radio operator right after my 14th birthday. And that got me to the point where I was in high school. I was going into high school, and I got involved in the audiovisual club. We had the largest single high school in the state of New Jersey, which is where I grew up, in a city called Clifton, and it was the 11th largest city in New Jersey. And so we had a pretty active program in audiovisual programming, and so I nominally learned some things about audiovisual stuff. And my family doctor, who I always consider one of the very strong pivotal people in my life, had known me since I was an infant, and knew about my ham radio work, and knew about all the other interests I had, knew about me being involved in audiovisual. And his cousin just happened to be the co-director of the Audiovisual Center at Montclair State College, which at that time was a school of about 4,000 students, and it was a teacher's institution. And I had felt like I had a calling into the Baptist ministry up to that point in time, but got to Montclair State College because my father said, it's 2.5 miles from home, and I had a work scholarship there before I was admitted. My family doctor, talked his cousin into giving me a job. So I was
good timing.
Yeah, it was perfect way of getting into the whole thing. And so I got to the school, and it was the largest audiovisual center in the state of New Jersey, including the State University, Rutgers. So I had a tremendous learning experience there. College, I actually founded that radio station at Montclair State College, and that was in 1967. So that radio station, at the time that we're recording this interview, is now in its 50th anniversary year.
Oh, wow.
And so little did I know that this little dream that I had back then for a little station to help the people in the area be able to keep up with what was going on at the college would ultimately become part of the curriculum of a 22,500 student university, the second largest university in New Jersey. But ultimately, several thousand students have gone through that radio station, several hundred have had broadcasting careers. And they're celebrating their 50th anniversary, which I'll be going back to in May of this year to see what's happened. I've actually been back, and they've recorded some interviews with me and things of that nature. But when I arrived, little to my knowledge, foreknowledge, I wasn't going to end up doing the usual audiovisual stuff with projectors and overheads and all that sort of thing. He had me slated to be a student supervisor of over 50 other students. And I also was doing disc cutting, which I had never done before. And I was doing tape recording, which I had never done before. And I was doing live sound for all the touring concert programs that came in, all the name artists, rock and roll. And back in those days, there was a lot of the early popular folk music, Serendipity Singers and New Christy Minstrels and all those kind of groups. So I was getting to do a lot of really interesting stuff, work with a lot of interesting people. So
were you doing both live sound, and were you doing recording of them, or could you do recording?
Well, let's put it this way. We were doing live sound, and we weren't supposed to be recording.
Ah, okay.
But we did.
Okay.
We always found ways to turn recorders on and have them hidden someplace.
Right.
And so that was part of the beginning. And one day I was assigned to do sound for the Count Basie Orchestra. And so here I was with, nice sound setup, and just happened by circumstance to have an Ampex studio recorder sitting right next to me while I was doing the sound. And I just happened to have some tape that I brought along with me. And so I recorded the thing illicitly and still have those tapes.
Really? Wow.
And that was the night that I decided the Baptist ministry wasn't where I was going. I was going to be in the recording industry and the sound industry. And that's where it all began. And that's been, you know, my future was kicked off right then and there. I started actually doing freelance recording by the end of my freshman year and into my sophomore year in college. Usually using other people's equipment because I didn't have any of my own and didn't have the money for it. But by the time I was, I don't remember, I joined in my junior year or my sophomore year, but I was a member of the Audio Engineering Society and hobnobbing with all the people in the New York recording industry. And by the time I got into my senior year, I had done all kinds of sound for lots of groups and still enjoy doing live sound. But I was really tending more towards the recording part of the industry, and I really enjoyed it. And it was a passion, basically. I was recording all the concerts at school and all that sort of thing, and it gave me a great opportunity to experiment and learn a lot. Plus, my hanging around the New York studios gave me a chance to see what was going on in the recording industry of that time, which is very different than the recording industry of today. Multi-track recording was just coming into play. I saw the very first 8-track recorder that Scully made, and saw the 12-track recorders, which very few people have ever seen because there weren't very many of them ever made, because then they jumped from there to 16-track. I was in Ultrasonic Studios in Hempstead, Long Island, which is Bill Stahl's original studio in the storefront out there, and he did, I think he did Iron Butterfly and some of the psychedelic groups back in those days. But it was interesting because he was the guy that bought the first 8-track Scully recorder off the floor at the AES convention, and they actually became so busy and so booked up. They had a 4-track console, and so they had a technician on his back under the board, rewiring the board in between takes. So that's the kind of the way the industry went back in those days.
Right. Yeah.
And so ultimately, I was learning a lot about a lot of things. I grew up about 7 miles or 8 miles from Les Paul. Never had the opportunity to get to meet him, but that, of course, was where the very first Ampex 8-track recorder was. He and Ampex created that together. So, and I was about 7 or 8 or 10 miles from Rudy Van Gelder, of course, who's the well-known jazz recording guy who built his house to be a recording studio. And so that's where I cut my teeth in that environment with those kind of people all around there. So from that point, I determined that I had moved out of the Audiovisual Center after 2 years. They couldn't afford to pay me anymore because I was working so many hours for them. And I was, of course, a full-time student. But I went into another part of the college where I became the assistant to the director of student activities. So I ended up now in a whole different situation, which kind of opened up some new doors for me in different ways, but also introduced me to more of the musicians on the campus and so on. So I was able to do more in that direction. My father died in my middle of my senior year, at the end of my first semester, going into my second semester in college. And so I had to rethink a lot of things. And that's when I started to think about how I was going to get some real recording gear and start making a real living out of doing some recording work. So I started buying up some Sonys. I had bought a Sony recorder and a couple of other little things, and then I guess I ended up somewhere along the way with a Concertone 505, and I've owned 2 of those over the years.
Do you remember what the Sony was?
A 464D, I think. Yeah. And then I ended up with my first truly professional recorder, Magnacord 728. Yeah. And it was portable because it had a handle on it, and I couldn't pick it up today if I had to. But it was 10-inch reels, 15 IPS, and so I was able to really do a lot of stuff on that. Now, of course, the preamps weren't that great, and it was a very noisy machine. It was a lot of mechanical noise and even electronic noise. It wasn't a great machine, but it was professional. I mean, the radio stations used them and all that. And then I moved to Syracuse, New York, because I was accepted at Syracuse University, Newhouse School of Communications, for a master's degree in television and radio. And so I figured, well, there's a direction I can go. So I went up there and spent a little over a year, and got my master's degree in television and radio. And of course, Syracuse at that time, and even today, is one of the top schools in the country. I mean, everybody that hears the name Newhouse, Dick Clark went there, Bob Costas. I mean, the list of people that have gone through that school is huge. So I had that piece of paper that I left there with. But I also was doing more and more recording. So I was acquiring, I purchased a pair of Synchron AU7A condenser microphones. Most people have never seen them or have any idea what they are, but they were some of the early microphones that were battery-powered condenser microphones. A little noisy, but did the job. Sort of modeled after a Neumann U87, but not anything like a U87. And then I had a pair of Sony C37As, which were fantastic mics. And I wish I could afford them today. I wish I'd never sold the ones that I had. Yeah. And so, and I picked up an Ampex 354. That was my first Ampex recorder. Oh, cool. Yeah. And so then I was doing remote recording all over New York State, doing band concerts and band festivals and choirs and churches and little jazz groups and choral groups of all kinds, and you know, anybody that would pay me a few dollars to record them. Yeah, my first record I cut while I was in college, and I still have a copy of it, I think. And I won't let too many people hear that one.
I never could find my recital tapes or music.
So that one was a record for a small church, and I won't go into the fun of that one. But after that, I affiliated with a company called Custom Fidelity out of Santa Monica, or Pasadena, California. A fellow by the name of Dave Burkus, who started that company when he was in high school, and learned how to cut discs, and got himself, I think, a Scully lathe to start with, and he was cutting discs, and then he eventually he ended up buying some record presses and pressing his own vinyl. He sent the metal work out, but he did the pressing, and the album work was all done in-house and all that. They had an art department. And they were in competition with Century Records, for people who remember the days of Century. Yeah. And there were some affiliates for Custom Fidelity around the country, and so I occasionally get together with some of them in different parts of the country and hang out a little bit, and we helped each other out with things. One of them was a fellow by the name of Wes Dooley, who had a company called AES, and is well known in the industry for making ribbon microphones. And he copied some of the RCA technology, and today makes some fine ribbon microphones. He's still in the business, and his microphones are known pretty much throughout the industry for that sort of thing.
What period of time was that?
I started college in 1963, and that's when I made my decision on what industry I wanted to go into. And I was at Syracuse, got there in 1967, and was there through 1968, finishing the degree, and stayed up there one more year after that, and was trying to make a living doing this in a very relatively small market. Syracuse's city was maybe 250,000, and there was one honest-to-goodness recording studio in town, and then there was another guy who was actually the Ampex service technician, who I got to know, and he had a small studio in his basement, and then I was working out of a townhouse or an apartment, wherever I happened to be. And most of my work was location. I mean, virtually everything I did was on location stuff. And so that was the starts. That was through the early through the middle of 1969. And then I had this little piece of cardboard in my wallet called a draft card. I was 24 years old, had completed a master's degree, and the military wouldn't let go of me. And so I knew the hammer was coming down, and so at that point in time I made a decision to go to Washington, D.C. and find out who was in charge of recording and radio and television for the Air Force, and find my own job. I was not going to be drafted for 2 years. I figured I'd just enlist for 4 and at least do what was going to help me in my future career, and at the same time do something that would be helpful for the country. So I was freelancing at a TV studio in Syracuse, a educational TV station. we call them public stations today.
Right.
And there was a little rock group performing there. They had one-hit wonders. They had a song called "Kites Are Fun." The group was called The Free Design. They were out of Buffalo, New York, and they were on Enoch Light's label. And they were doing a little feature at the TV station. And I was talking to the drummer, and I said, you know, what's your draft status? And he said, well, I'm 4F. I'm not going in. I don't have to worry. And he said, but Chris, one of the other members of the family group, he wasn't a member of the family. He said he has to go, and he's going into the Air Force, and he's going to be an arranger and composer for the Air Force Band in Washington, D.C., which is the biggest Air Force band and the highest level Air Force band. And I said, well, I'm planning to fly down to D.C. and find out who's in charge of radio, TV, and recording for the Air Force and find myself a job down there. And he said, why do you want to go down there? He's sitting right on the other side of the studio. And I said, what do you mean? He says, that guy over there. And there's a guy in a very, like a zoot suit type of sport jacket and a very conservative haircut. So I said, I'll go and introduce myself. So I went over and I introduced myself, and he said, I'm Jack Oswald, Major Jack Oswald from Secretary of the Air Force, Office of Information, Command Services Unit in Washington, D.C. So I told him what my plan was and my background, and we had a great conversation. We liked each other immediately. We hit it right off, and he says, I'd hire you on the spot. He says, but you need to meet the rest of the team because you have to work with them and they need to know you. So he says, get on that plane, come on down. And so I flew down there and we met up with everybody. Everybody said, yep, we like them. And so that took me to Washington, D.C., and took my little business with me, and we expanded that out and spent almost 3 years by the time I got to Washington producing. Had a cutting edge studio, finest state-of-the-art studio that you could want, Electrodyne console, and we still had Ampex 300s in there, but those are all replaced shortly after I got there with all new Scullys. And a nice microphone complement. And we had the Air Force Band 3 blocks away, so we were working with all the guys up there, some of the best musicians in the world. And it took me into studios in Washington, D.C., and again back into New York. I got into Nashville and spent time in Hollywood. So it just opened up a world to me, and I got a massive amount of education out of that 4 years in the Air Force.
Right. Was their studio like connected to where the band was playing?
No, they had their own studio at the band, okay. But for a lot of the stuff that we did with the band, we took them we had two people, Ed Green, whose name you may have heard. Ed was primarily a location recording guy. He had been with the Army Band years before, and his initial claim to fame was he did the In Crowd with Ramsey Lewis Trio. It was recorded in Washington, D.C., and he did the recording and mixing and put that together. And then he had a lot of other things that came after that, but he became well known in the industry through the Audio Engineering Society. So he was eventually hired away by MGM Studios, Val Valentine in California, in Hollywood, to help design the new MGM studios, recording studios they were building out there. So he went out there, and so we used Ed as one of our recording sources in Washington, D.C. when we were recording the Airmen of Note, which is the military's version of the Glenn Miller, the original Glenn Miller Orchestra, some of the finest musicians in the world. And so we also used an outfit called Rodell Recording. It was another place that we took them to in Washington, D.C. And then we would take them out to California, and we recorded primarily at that time at MGM. Eventually we went to, I think the engineer's name was Hugh Davies, and he was at Capitol recording, and took them into the Capitol studios from time to time. So I got to spend time out there, and we brought a lot of great artists in of the time. I'm trying to remember, I think we had Teresa Brewer in, we had Frank Sinatra Jr., Joni James, Joni Summers, just all kinds of great musicians of the time, and worked with them there.
Were you doing the engineering?
No, Ed did the engineering, and I did the kibitzing.
Okay.
So I was actually out there on other assignments because I was doing interview programs for the Air Force, and so I just would schedule my trips to the West Coast to coincide with when the Note was going to be out there, and that way I could always go hang out in the studio and, you know, spend a few extra days in the West Coast and hanging out there. Yeah. So that expanded a lot of my horizons. I mean, I made a lot of contacts and learned a heck of a lot of information from a lot of people. Mm. So, and then meanwhile, I was building my recording business back in Washington, D.C. on the side. So I got out of the Air Force on March 15th of 1973, and on March 16th I walked into my own office that we had opened full-time 3 months before, and had
Great.
a couple of people at the office running the place, and we'd be over there in the evenings and weekends. We had been doing all the way through from the time I got to Washington in 1970. We had studios pretty much operating in the basement of one of my partner's houses, and so we were doing stuff all the way through.
What kind of equipment were you using at that time?
We had the Ampex that I had. We had in the basement studio, one of our clients bought the 8-track cartridge, the 8-track 1-inch machine that would have been very similar to the original Les Paul machine. It was a Ampex 300 deck with, he originally had 300 electronics in his, 350 electronics in his. We had Ampex 351 electronics in the one that we had. None of the biases matched up. They were in sync at all, so every time we turned the machine on, we'd have to turn it on about an hour and a half before the session. And then I'd pull the machine out, I'd climb in. The cabinet was so big that I could actually climb inside the back of it. And I would sit there and tweak each one of the biases until we got rid of all the chirps and tweets and birdies, and then we'd do the session. So, you know, we had a preparation time before a client came in. But that's the way it was back in those days. That's part of the fun of recording.
I'll bring it up on the console.
That's right. So that was what we did there. So we had the 8-track, and then we had our 2-track, and then we bought a 4-track Ampex AG440. And then eventually, when we moved into the studios in DC, we had our own 8-track built, which was a Ampex FR1100 instrumentation deck, and had Nortronics 8-track heads put on that, 1-inch heads, and we had 4 panels, 8 channels altogether of Inovonics electronics, which were built to replace the noisy tube electronics of the Ampex days. So we ended up with the quietest 8-track machine in the Washington, D.C. area, so other studios were renting the machine from us when we weren't using it, because it was a great machine for, you didn't need to use Dolby or anything, it was so quiet. And so that was our studio in Washington. I loved music, that was my thing. We still did music of kinds, but Washington, D.C. was not a music market. There were music studios there, but they weren't making a lot of money. But then again, most studios never made a lot of money. That's kind of, it's the wrong end of the business. Yeah. But it was an information market. And so what we were doing was information products. And so we did, matter of fact, a friend of mine that I just spent some time with was one of my early recording engineers that worked for us. And he was reminding me of a dictation course that we recorded called Quick Hand. And it was one of our regular voiceover guys was in doing that. It was weeks of recording time to put this whole package together, and it was like, you know, we'd have to wake Paul up every once in a while because it was such a boring thing that we were doing, but that paid the bills, and that's what we did. Our studio was basically booked 5 days a week. We had 2 sessions every day. We didn't sell any hourly time. We only sold by session. So we were booked 3 hours in the morning and 3 hours in the afternoon every day, 5 days a week. It was just locked out. So any cleanup work or administrative work or any of that had to be done in the evenings or weekends. And of course, we did do some music stuff. We did have some guys that come in. Even though our studio was only 10 foot by 10 foot, we made the control room larger. So we put a lot of the instruments in the control room. So we do a rhythm track by putting the piano and bass directly into the console in the control room, and they'd listen off the monitor speakers, and we put the drums in the booth, and we'd lay the rhythm track down, then we go back with the 8-track and track everything else down. And so we had a fair amount of really interesting stuff. We did a 3,000 voice choir at DAR Constitution Hall. That was a real challenging project. I've recorded the Washington Cathedral, I've recorded the National Presbyterian Center. I did the only, maybe still the only recording of a Puccini Mass that nobody remembered that he ever wrote, called the Messa di Gloria, and recorded that in the name of the little town, New York City, just outside of New York City in Queens. There was a small church up there that was going to perform that, and somebody booked us to go all the way up there and put that together, so we did an album of that. Just a lot of interesting things.
How many mics were you using at that point to do a large thing like that? I mean, and was it coming back through a board, a portable board, or?
More or less.
Right.
Everything we did, we had a jury rig pretty much. I was always a minimalist philosophically. I tried to use the least number of microphones as I possibly could and find the balances and the sweet points and all that sort of thing. So we had tall stands and we had whatever we needed. But typically, that 3,000 voice choir we recorded on 4-track, as I recall, and we probably had maybe 8 microphones feeding the 4-track. Yeah. And that was,
sufficient. Yeah.
Sufficient for that. I mean, the choir took up the entire stage of DAR Constitution Hall, the apron in front of the stage, or what would have been an orchestra pit in a lot of places, and then we had them in the stadium style seating on the left and right side of the stage. So we had kind of a wide sweep of all these people that were singing. And it was a one-time thing. I don't know if they ever did anything like that again, but it was a Christian organization, I guess, that did it, and we got it booked. So, and then we did a number of other things like that. One of our interesting projects was during the bicentennial years. I should mention that we also got into the tape duplicating business. Oh, wow. While I was still in graduate school, I made a trip down to my home state in New Jersey, and somehow I ended up visiting a tape duplicating plant. And I walked into that tape duplicating plant, and it was kind of like a mezzanine, the way they built the place. And the floor was down below with all the slaves. And they had 10 lines of 10 slaves with Ampex 3200 machines, duplicating 8-track cartridges primarily and cassette tape. And so I just stood there and I was just amazed. I said to myself, nickel, 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 as I went down and looked at each of these machines turning. And I said, I have to be in that business. So before too long, we were one of the duplicators in the Washington, D.C. market and became one of the larger duplicators in the market because we again learned how to do things that very few people knew how to do. We had the first automatic cassette loading equipment in town. We did 2 8-track cartridge projects. We pulled the heads off the machine. I said, don't ever let me see them again. I don't care where you put them, but I don't ever want to see those heads again. And so we primarily did reel-to-reel duplicating for radio spots, and I had a client who did syndicated organ music for roller skating rinks. And so they'd send us the masters and we'd duplicate those up, and they'd sell them to the roller skating rinks they supported. But we did all kinds of products. We did wild animal sounds for Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey Circus on cassettes. We did early audio magazines. We did all kinds of training materials and educational materials. And we also had a video production wing that did video, and we also did multimedia presentations of the day, which were mainly done manually. So when Friendship Airport, which later became Baltimore Washington International Airport, decided they were going to do a big expansion into the world market for air freight, they went to an advertising agency, and the agency came to us, and we developed a multi-screen, multi-track soundtrack with slides and 16mm motion picture, and had to operate it all manually behind the screen with rear screen projection. So, and we got it all done and introduced Friendship Airport to the world through this thing, and then there's a big audience out there, and we were all patting ourselves on the back, and the advertising agency called us up a couple of weeks later and said we have to redo it again because they changed the name of the airport to Baltimore Washington International. So we had to go back and change everything and redo the whole project. So that was one of our interesting experiences. And then,
and I assume they paid for it.
Oh yeah. And then one day I was in downtown DC, and it was the bicentennial years, 1975 going into 1976. And I hadn't heard I'd seen some bicentennial radio, TV spots, but I hadn't heard anything on the radio. And I said, wonder what they're doing with radio. So I found their offices for the American Revolution Bicentennial Administration, who was headed up by John Warner, later a senator from Virginia, and prior to that, the Secretary of Navy. And so I found the place. I was just in my blue leisure suit with my Nehru shirt, with my big medallion hanging around my neck, my long hair and my beard, and my bell-bottom pants. And I walked into this place, and I just bounced from desk to desk to desk to desk until I finally found the decision maker somewhere back in the depths of the building, and sat down and had a meeting with her. And I asked her what they were doing in the way of radio. And she said, we hadn't thought about it. And I said, well, you're missing all those people that are in their cars in drive time all over the United States. she said, well, send me a proposal. So I went back, got my suppliers, put a proposal together, and she bought it. So we did all the radio public service announcements for the bicentennial year, which went to every radio station. We wrote them, we recorded them, we produced them, we duplicated them, and we distributed them to every radio station in the United States and all the territories and American Forces Radio and TV.
How big was your staff at that point?
At our peak, we had about 28 employees. At that time, we might have had probably somewhere close to that. But we had developed ways to duplicate and I mean, we only had 2 1/4-inch reel-to-reel slaves, but we could turn a project out like that with 6,000 copies in one day. Basically duplicate it today, have it cut down tomorrow, and have it in the mail the 3rd day. So we had to do that every month for that period of time. So a lot of innovation back in those days, because we didn't have digital technology. There was digital technology. There was a company in Salt Lake City, I think, that had 2 or 3 hard disk recorders. They were the first ones. They didn't sell them. They only rented them, and they would send their own engineer with the machines. And the classical people, Columbia Records and RCA and all those people, would book those out, and they were doing all the early classical recording at that time. Started doing it all digitally because of the transparency of the sound. Right. But we didn't have it. Yeah. We were all analog.
How long were you doing all of that in Washington with the duplication and everything else?
We were doing that for about 4 or 5 years, and then there was a big recession back around that period of time. It kind of hit us and kind of clobbered us, is what happened. So we ended up closing that business down and moved to Annapolis, Maryland. And so, but that was part of the training and learning that I had. That when we built our studio in Washington, D.C., I said it was all basically pretty much an information-based recording business. So when we designed the studio complex, our studio itself was only 10 feet by 10 feet roughly. And the control room was quite a bit larger because we could do more things inside the control room when we wanted to play around. But we designed the entire room so that it was a multifaceted room. We actually had 2 broadcast turntables in there so we could do record shows and do syndicated radio programs. We had broadcast cartridge machines in there so we could do radio spots and plug them right in just like they would in a radio station. We had 8-track recorder, 4-track recorder, 2-track recorder. So we had the capability of recording everything from a multi-track music track all the way through a syndicated radio show. Rolling Stone magazine had a radio series at that time, and they used to use our studio for putting their show together, and we duplicate and distribute for those people.
They send you on a thing like that. I mean, they would have already done the interview.
They had the interviews done, and they actually sent their own producer over, a gal by the name of Hank Philippi, and it was either her or I think it was her. She eventually ended up as a TV anchor, I think, in Atlanta, Georgia, and then her daughter, I think, eventually got into broadcasting as well. But she would come over and she'd cut her own tape, and we'd just give her the control room, and we'd go on and do other things. She'd cut the tape. When she was satisfied, she'd give us the master. She had it done, and we'd duplicate it and send it out the door. So. But we had to learn interesting, again, necessity is the mother of invention, and we had a hard time initially selling the studio. We couldn't get the studio booked. We were just outside the District of Columbia line. We weren't in downtown Washington. We were in Maryland, actually. And, we tried all kinds of things to get the word out and get people into the studio, and we couldn't do it. But we were doing okay with getting tape duplicating clients in. And so I just started kind of a reverse process. We'd get somebody calling about tape duplication, or we'd solicit somebody and they'd say, sure, we want to do this, and we'd give them a quote on the thing, and then I'd ask them, by the way, I said, do you have your master tapes done? Oh, well, we haven't got that. I said, well, we just happen to have recording studios available. And that was the backdoor approach to getting the studio booked, so after that we were booked solid from that point forward. And so it was another process of learning.
You mentioned at one point that you had let 8-track go out to other studios that they would use it. Did it actually leave the studio?
Oh yeah. They'd come and pick it up.
No problem.
Well, that was another long story. Yes, we had to go out, and we had a 9 o'clock session. It was a jingle session, which we didn't do a lot of that, but we had one scheduled for a Monday morning, and the machine was supposed to be back before the session, and it was 9 o'clock, and the machine wasn't back, and the clients in the studio and the musicians are there, and finally the machine comes rolling into the studio, and the guy rushes in. He drops a check on my secretary receptionist's desk, and leaves the machine, and he runs out the door, and he's gone. And so we grabbed the machine, rolled it in the studio, put it up on the platform behind the console, grabbed the cables, and we had everything into master harness cables, so we didn't have to plug in all the individual cables. And we plugged it in, and we always ran alignment tapes on everything. And we had an oscilloscope built right into the console, so we can take a look at everything and make sure everything was staying in alignment. And boy, I'd never seen patterns on a thing like that. And so I stopped the tape and pulled it off and looked, and big gash down the play head, big gash down the record head. The stainless steel tape guides had been crimped and turned around backwards so we couldn't see it. And it was a mess. So it cost us a lot of money, and we in the session, and we had, we went after the guy, and we were never able to solve the problem with him, so we just had to go and get it taken care of. But that kind of put the dampers on letting the machine out the door. We were very careful. We still did it, but we had a group that was a specialty was remote recording. They had a beautiful remote truck they built up, and they would rent the machine from us, and then they'd come back and they'd use our studio to do. They were doing. Back in those days, it was quadraphonic. Right. It wasn't surround sound then, it was quadraphonic. And they were doing some quadraphonic stuff, so we wired the studio up special for them so we could do some quadraphonic mixing, and so they'd come in and do the mixing and editing, and so we had some interesting projects they brought in there. And, that was, you just learned all kinds of interesting things. So when we put our loop bin duplicating system in, where you take a master tape, which was either 1/2 inch or 1 inch, ours happened to be a 1 inch loop bin. It was designed for 8-track cartridges. And the problem we had was the master ran at 240 inches per second, or 20 feet of tape per second. And our slaves ran at 60 and 120 inches per second. And so, and they were all modified Ampex 300s. So the challenge we had was we were doing cassettes mainly, and our cassettes being information would be 60-minute and 90-minute cassettes for the most part. And once we made a master and put it in the loop bin, the master was so big and it would ride on air. Once you load it in the loop bin, it would pull the tape out of the one side of the loop bin, run it across the heads, back down into the loop bin, spit it back out the other side, deflect it in, and it would just sit there and it would layer back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The air would build up in there. And at the ends where you spliced it together, so it was a continuous loop, we put a little piece of aluminum sensing tape there, and that would hit the sensor that would trigger the 25 hertz tone that the cassette loader would trigger on. And so what would happen is this thing is running at 240 inches per second, and you just sit there and watch it, and you know what was going to happen, and it slowly ride up, ride up, ride up, ride up, ride up until it got right to the heads, and then it was like an explosion. The tape would get caught in the capstan at 240 inches per second. There'd be shards of tape flying in every direction, a big loud crash. And we got another roll, $25 roll of tape that we had to go and make another master, which took another hour and a half. So we had to come up with a solution for that. So we actually were probably the first duplicators in the country that nobody knew about, who were duplicating at 64:1, because we started making our masters at 3 3/4 instead of 7 1/2. We did our tests, and on cassettes they came out, and quality-wise couldn't tell a difference, even on the music parts of the audio-visual programs. And so we were able to cut the length of the masters in half by doing that. And then we discovered something that, again, nobody probably ever figured out, and that was that there was a place in Long Island who was selling salvaged instrumentation tape. You may remember the big computers that use tape, and you see them just spinning back and forth. Well, it was very thin tape, and it was extremely high tensile strength. We would buy a reel of tape of that nature for $2, I think is what we were paying, or maybe it was more, but it was very inexpensive compared to the $25. And there'd be 10,000 feet of tape on that reel instead of 2,500 feet of tape on that reel. And now the masters were just taking up a small amount of the space in the bin. and we found out that the tape had no high end on it. It was endless. It was we took an oscillator and we just kept turning it up and turning it up and turning it up, and it was flat all the way out. So 40,000 hertz, and it was still flat. So now we had tape that we could use. That was so we locked all our doors. Nobody ever got back in the duplicating plant after that, because we didn't want anybody to see what we were doing back there. We only duplicated in one shift, but we had to run 2 shifts in order to keep up with our loading, because we didn't have enough loading equipment to keep up with on what we could duplicate. So we always had stacks of tape sitting around. So again, this is all part of this recording industry, and all part of a technology that's now obsolete at this point in time. I mean, none of this exists anymore. I mean, every tape we ever did, and we were so precise in the Air Force that our tapes were the standards. The government record pressing plant in those days was Kaiser Century Corporation in Saugus, California. They made the vinyl, and they also had their own pressing plant, and that was the Century Records. Essentially, that was their custom record division. But they did all the government pressing. It was a GSA contract. They had it all for every agency, and they used our tapes from our operation, our Serenade and Blue tapes, and any of the other tapes that we sent them for record pressing. They used our tapes as a standard that everybody else's tapes had to match up to. So that was how high our quality was. I mean, there was nothing that went out of our studio that wasn't the highest quality, and I just carried that over into our own business, and that was the way we did everything there. So everything was, as good and pristine as you can possibly get a tape, and you could take our tape and take it anywhere else in the country, and if they were up to standards, they could play our tape and have it come play back the same way.
How long did you then keep on with that in Washington?
We did that until 1977. And it was one of those things where we ran out of money. We were doing well, but then we had these 2 months where the recession clobbered us. So we shut that operation down, and I had a couple of good clients. I took them with me, and ultimately I ended up with another small duplicating business, and we ended up doing mainly conference recording type of work, and we did millions of cassettes for Amway distributors around the country, and we actually maintained an inventory of duplicated programs of theirs, about 12 to 15,000 tapes on the shelf, any cassettes at any given point in time. So they basically got same-day delivery. They call up and order the product, and it was out the door in that afternoon by UPS, and they usually get it the next day or the day after. So there were very few people that were able to do that sort of thing. And then eventually I merged that business with a guy that had 2 generations after me had taken the job that I had in the Air Force. And so we became friends, and I had him doing my technical work because he was a technician and engineer, and his wife was working part-time for us loading tapes. So we ended up merging with him because when he got out of the Air Force and had a small business going, and we ended up almost in competition with each other. So we just decided it wasn't fun to be in competition since we were friends, so we decided to merge. And we did that for a few years, and he had a different management technique than I had. And so we went our separate ways, and we were still friends all these years later, and we still work together on projects. But it worked better for me just to go back independent again. So I remained pretty much independent. We had about 28 employees when we were merged, and so we're back to spending massive amounts of time managing people, and that wasn't really the fun part of the business. So from time to time I'd get a little project that would involve music, and I got into digital recording in 1995. I kind of looked at the big picture and I said, well, my life is over as I know it. Analog is going out the door. And
when did you get rid of your analog stuff?
Oh, piece by piece over the next several years. Actually, my last Ampex was a hybrid. It was an HG350 deck with a bow motor in it that was a 3-speed motor that was reversible, so I could run tapes backwards or forwards. And then I had Innovonics electronics in it, so when I sold that, I sold the console to one person. It was an Ampex 440 console. One guy bought the console, one guy bought the transport, one guy bought the motor, and one guy bought the electronics. So they went in 4 different directions, and I could make more money off that machine by selling it piecemeal than I could selling it as a solid machine. So that was my last. However, saying that, I also had Otari 5050s, and I've had Technics RS 1500s, and I still own a Technics RS 1500 that I use for.
Those are such great.
They're fantastic. I use it just for transfer when I can't carry it with me because my vehicle's too small. Otherwise, I have work that I could be doing on it. So I've got it sitting in a used record store in Kaiser, West Virginia, where it's being stored for free, and he's wondering if I'll ever come back and get it. And but I've got a lot of tapes that I still need to transfer off for my own and other people.
That's really an incredibly cool history. You said you were traveling around and just going back and visiting studios too that you wanted to visit with, been in and that. And
yeah,
that was really cool.
There's still the little meccas. I haven't been to Fame Recordings in Muscle Shoals yet, but that's on my agenda to get there. I've been to Sun or Memphis Recording Service, Sam Phillips' original place, where it's iconic. Right. And of course, he had another studio he built right after the lease was up on the first studio, about a block away. I've been to that studio, and I've been to the Stax Record Museum. They destroyed that whole block for urban renewal, which they never did. So some people got a hold of it, a nonprofit group, and they built a museum there and a music school. And I've been to, trying to think some of the other, I was just before I came to see you, I was in Houston and was at Sugar Hill Recording. Yeah. Which is a museum of itself in its own right.
I need to go see it. Dan has been very supportive of us.
I was there with this guy, Josh Appleby, who is a young guy, probably in his 30s or, thereabouts, and he rents a small studio space from them. They've got the 2 active studios that are still busy, and one of them is the original one that was built in 1941. Oh, wow. It's the only recording studio, and probably the oldest one, continuously operating since it was founded in 1941 in the country. Wow. Because he's got some great stuff. They were using PT6 electronics from Magnacords for mic pre's.
Oh my God.
Oh. So, I mean, and they had all kinds of, just the old AM10 Ampex mixers. I had that in one room, and it's just, I mean, it's a great history lesson just to go in there. And of course, these people, I was sitting there, my eyes would get that big when I see another piece of history, and Josh didn't have any clue. They had an AG448 track sitting there, and I knew all about that machine, and I was teaching him all kinds of things that he didn't know about. So at this stage of my life, I've done so many things. When we met through your DVDs, and as I went through the DVDs and looked, I can't even believe the number of pieces of equipment that I saw in there that I've either operated or owned over the years. Stuff that I've forgotten I even owned. I mean, as a matter of fact, sitting out in the van right now, I have a PMD 430 Marantz recorder that I use for transferring cassettes. I'm finding people have cassettes that they want transferred and digitized because they don't know how to do it themselves. And so I just visited an old author of mine. I was a book publisher for 12 years. And just visited an old author of mine, and she said, "You produce these tapes," but she said, "I need to have them digitized." So I said, "Geez, I don't even know if I have the original masters anymore." So she gave me some of the old tapes, and so I'm going to transfer them, digitize them, run them through a restoration program and stuff like that. So I carry that with me. I had gotten rid of all my cassette decks. I had no cassette decks left, and all of a sudden people started calling me and wanted me to do this kind of restoration.
But there's this huge company in somewhere, Virginia or something, that is continuing, that's always done mass production of cassettes.
Oh, it's in Kansas City, I think.
Oh, really? Okay.
National Audio.
Yeah. And they did a thing on like Good Morning America or something on that.
It's becoming a very niche market. Yeah. You know who Rudy Van Gelder is?
Yes.
Blue Note and all those. He had his studio. And unfortunately, like what happens to a lot of us, virtually all of us at some point in time, is that the old order changes, yielding place to the new. So, those of us who have white hair and are long of the tooth, we're kind of the dinosaurs now, and doesn't mean we don't know things, doesn't mean we can't do things, just means that people are looking for the young people who do it cheaper. And so I kind of looked at the articles about Rudy and all those years and all those masters and all those fantastic artists that he worked with. And they ended up, basically, he was spending the rest of his life until he died about 2 years ago, I think, just taking those and converting them to digital masters and restoring them so that they could be used in digital domain. So, no more people coming there and blocking his studio out. He still had the studio, but people just weren't booking him to do it anymore. My awakening came back, I guess, in the 90s. I think it was still in the 90s, and I went and I said, you know, I want to do music again. I was, you know, I'm 30-some-odd year veteran in this business, and I want to do some music again. That's what I got into this for, and it's fun. So, and you know, I'm a veteran, so I should be able to get a reasonable price for doing that kind of work. So I put together a brochure, and I put together a rate card and everything, and I was in D.C. area, Springfield, Virginia, and I stopped in one of the music emporia, and they 2 or 3 tabloids that were published in Washington, D.C. for the recording and music scene. I grabbed them and I went over to the Dairy Queen. It was a couple doors up. It was a hot summer day, and so I looked at all the toys, and I got myself some ice cream. I sat down and was thumbing through these things, and all of a sudden I'm seeing these ads in there, and they're charging $25 and $30 an hour for doing 32-track and 48-track recording. Yeah. And I said, I was getting more than that doing 2-track recording in 1975. Yeah. And that was $1975. I mean, you know. Yeah. I said, holy mackerel. So I said, this is basically becoming like being a $1,000, is kind of crass, being a $1,000 a night call girl and going back and turning $20 tricks again. And I said, I'm just not going to do that. So that was, I threw them all away. never did anything.
People new musicians now are wanting to produce cassettes.
Yeah. And they're still doing vinyl.
Right, yes.
I was at United Pressing in Nashville a few years ago and went through the plant there. But there's no vinyl being made in the United States anymore. All the vinyl has to be imported. There's nobody making vinyl for records. All comes in containers from overseas. I'm doing it because I can do it on the road if I'm doing cassettes, and if I ever get a little bit bigger vehicle than I have right now, I probably will mount the Technics on board, and then I can do reel-to-reel stuff. I'm actually finding people, you know, really want to do this stuff. Yeah. I've got 5 tapes in there right now that a guy had that have his father's voice on them telling his life story. And the guy's never heard them. His father's been dead for 10 years. So, and he has no way to play them back because he doesn't have a cassette recorder anymore. So I'm going to transfer those, and then you know, people keep. I just finished a project for friend / clients out in Colorado, and these were tapes that he had produced back around the 80s, beginning of the 80s, and he mastered them right to cassette. So I mean, they were the masters on cassette. So I just transferred them and did a little restoration on them, and you know, they'll pay me nicely for that. So, you know, it helps keep the gas in the tank. And
thank you.